In 1996, Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain gave the world the story of Kain, an assassinated nobleman turned vampire whose desire to rid him of his curse and avenge his death led him on a quest to save the mythical pillars of Nosgoth, and as a result, the entire world. This obviously went well, and 3 years later a sequel was released, telling us the story of a world restored by Kain's sacrifice. As you launch the game, you see a far more condensed set of introduction videos, as at this point in the series, Silicon Knights, the developers of the first game, were no longer involved for very complicated reasons. The main menu is very simple. You have two options, Start Game and Options, where the only things you can modify are the volume levels of specific parts of the audio. I really enjoy when games have different volume options for things like sound effects, dialogue and music. It wasn't always that common of a thing, and even these days some games do not give players this option, which, in my opinion, is a massive downside. One fun part of the main menu is the group of statues that take up half of the screen. Instead of being just a static image, the faces of the statues sometimes morph, revealing the vampiric nature of the depicted characters. Starting the game leads into a pre-rendered introduction video and, fine. Kain did not choose to sacrifice himself at the end of Blood Omen. Instead, he chose the other path, allowing the pillars to collapse while building his vampiric empire to rule the world as its god. To serve him and his empire, he created 6 lieutenants, one of whom is Raziel, Kain's firstborn, who is narrating the introduction segment.
I am Raziel, firstborn of his lieutenants. I stood with Kain and my brethren at the dawn of the Empire. I have served him a millennium.
Since the events of Blood Omen, 1,000 years have passed, and Kain rules from his throne, built atop the collapsed pillars of Nosgoth. No longer the sexy goth bad boy rockstar musician of Blood Omen, but looking more and more like the vampire Vorador did in the first game, having shed much of his human-like characteristics, replaced with what they call divinity. It is explained that periodically the vampires change, as Kain withdraws to metamorph, reappearing with a new ability, with the lieutenants following suit some years later. Now this status quo has been shaken, as Raziel is the first one to gain a new ability, demonstrating to Kain his new set of wings. Unfortunately, Kain does not seem to take this transgression well, ripping the bones from Raziel's back and ordering him to be executed within the ever-flowing watery abyss.
Cast him in.
This is a terrible fate for a vampire. As explained in the first game, water is extremely hazardous for a vampire, but it is not immediately deadly. Instead, being submerged in water is a form of torture that can last for millennia, as the vampire's body attempts to fight against the harm done by the flowing water, effectively immobilizing the victim in a state of unbearable torment until the eternal slumber finally arrives. Time passes as Raziel is submerged, until suddenly, he is awakened by a strange voice.
Raziel, you are worthy.
This voice, described in the manual as the Elder, or Elder God in the credits, explains to Raziel that he did in fact not survive the abyss, and the Elder God has merely rescued him from complete annihilation. Clearly, Raziel does not particularly enjoy his current form, but
I would choose oblivion over this existence.
The choice is not yours.
the Elder God further explains that the creation of new vampires traps souls into these undying vessels, preventing them from returning to what he calls the Wheel of Fate, and how he has recovered Raziel to act as his sole Reaver, or an Angel of Death, to destroy these undead abominations and free the souls back into the cycle they are meant to take part in, imploring that, if not for redemption, Raziel can take part in this quest for vengeance. In many ways, the beginning of Soul Reaver mirrors the beginning of Blood Omen. The protagonist is a nobleman who is murdered at the beginning, and the quest begins with a desire for retribution. Overall, the introduction is quite well done. It is not too long, and it gives enough backstory and exposition so it doesn't feel like you're missing something even if you've not played the previous game. Even the introduction of the new main character works well. You know enough of his history to properly understand his motivation to embark on his quest. Unlike the first game, Soul Reaver is fully 3D and displayed from a third-person perspective. And for a game of its era, it looks quite good. And here begins the tutorial. To move Raziel, you can either use the D-pad or the left analog stick for more accurate movement. Despite the game having come out several years after dual analog or dual shock controllers became available, Soul Reaver, however, does not take full advantage of the twin analog stick design, and the camera controls work the same whether you have a controller with analog sticks or not, by using the left and right rear trigger of the controller, pressing both of which allows you to enter a zoomed-in mode where you can look around more freely. Traversing through the corridors teaches you about the basic controls and features of the game, and unlike Blood Omen, Soul Reaver's tutorial is more like a traditional tutorial instead of the more free-form dungeon where features are taught organically. Instead, each room is there to teach a specific feature with pop-ups on the screen explaining what needs to be done and how. In this area, you can also see an interesting relic from this era. For some reason, which I still don't understand, whenever you enter a cutscene, the screen goes into letterboxed mode, which just seems completely pointless to me. Just like in Blood Omen, much of the world building and introductions to features are done via narration. This time replaced with the disembodied voice of the Elder God acting as your guide to the game, and Raziel's narration acting as your view into the in-game universe and lore about the vampire society that rose into power since the events of the first game. The first room introduces the fast travel system of the game, which takes the form of teleportation gates. For now, the gate you find is useless, as to use them you must unlock them in a similar fashion as the bat travel markers worked in Blood Omen. And at this point, this is the only active gate. Next, you are taught about healing. As in Blood Omen, to heal you must feed. But you are no longer a vampire per se, but a Soul Reaver, and thus blood is not your sustenance. Instead, you can feed on souls, which in this realm are abundant. You are also shown some of the traversal methods of the game. Basic jumping works as you'd expect, but you also have other jumping features to aid in your travels. Ledges can be grabbed and climbed, and crouching before jumping allows you to perform a high jump, which can aid in reaching higher ledges. Finally, you can also use the remains of your tattered wings to glide short distances. The final tutorial room introduces you to the basic combat system of the game by putting you against a pair of Sluar, spectral beings which feast on the souls of the dead. But instead of returning the souls to the Wheel of Fate, the souls fed on by these creatures are forever trapped within them. The primary weapon available to you are your claws, which can be used with the attack button. To add some complexity to the fighting, you can also lock on to an enemy and strafe around them while locked on. While doing so, you can also use the jump button to perform a dodge. The enemies here have a colored aura around them, which shows you the approximate health remaining, as the aura turns from blue to green to yellow to red. As you inflict enough damage, these creatures don't exactly die. Instead, they turn transparent and require sustenance to return back into a more corporeal form. While they are in this state, you can feed on them and draw their fleeing soul into your maw, restoring your health. Climbing even higher, you find a circle of misshapen pillars with a circular glow at their center. This is a portal between the spectral realm, which you've been traveling in, and the physical realm. To be able to use this portal, your health must first be fully restored, after which you can open the spell menu and select the spectral shift option. Doing so demonstrates one of the most interesting features of the game. The physical qualities of the separate realms can significantly differ, brilliantly demonstrated here as the misshapen pillars straighten and the blue-green glow of the spectral realm makes way to the more colorful sunlight of the physical realm. It is a very interesting way to immediately show the player that there will be differences between the realms, and perhaps this is an important thing to make a note of. While manifesting in the physical realm can only be performed within these portals, returning back into the spirit realm can be done at will. The Elder God also tells you that while in physical form you retain some of your vampiric weaknesses, such as being susceptible to damage from water. Immersing yourself in a pool of this deadly substance will immediately destroy your physical manifestation and return you to the spirit realm. This is also a brilliant place to demonstrate this feature if the player is to fall into the water, as you're unable to proceed further in the spirit realm. The pathway is blocked by a door, which you are unable to manipulate while in the spirit realm. As spirits have no physical representation, they have no effect on the features and creatures that manifest themselves in the physical realm. Thus, to proceed, you must be in the physical form to be able to perform a simple action such as opening a door. Next, you find yourself in an arena of sorts, and are faced with two grotesque beings, the visage of which shocks Raziel. These, the Elder God tells you, are the children of your vampire brother Dumas, feral beings with only one purpose: to feed. This portion acts as a secondary combat tutorial, but this time for the physical realm. Vampires as well do not just die, and must be dispatched via specific types of actions. As you fight the monsters, the health aura of the spirit realm has been replaced with a splatter of blood which gets larger the less health the enemy has. Draining the health of the enemy stuns them in a similar way that you could do in Blood Omen, except since you're fighting vampires, they do not die. Instead, to kill the vampires, you must either impale them on a sharp object, immerse them in water, burn them, or in the case of younger vampires, expose them to direct sunlight. This can be done when the enemy is stunned, and you are prompted to use the grab button to take hold of the enemy. Doing so allows you to carry the enemy and throw them towards a deadly hazard. Once the enemy has been damaged in this way, their soul detaches from their body and can be devoured, which permanently dispatches the enemy. This is a very interesting way of adding variety and complexity to the combat system. Once more, the combat itself is not exactly that complex, as the only primary means of combat are one attack button and the dodge button, which also acts as an attack if you dodge towards an enemy. While this already is slightly more involved than combat in Blood Omen, the addition of a kind of puzzle element to defeating your enemies is a clever way of adding interesting complexity to the system. Having destroyed your foes, you're introduced to one of the main mechanics of the game: moving blocks. As a sole Reaver, your strength is immense, and it's possible to move several massive objects within the game world, most of which take the form of cubic blocks. These can either be pushed, grabbed to drag them around, or by using crouch, you can move them while also turning the block by one increment. Dragging blocks also shows how much of the world is basically grid-based, as moving blocks is not smooth. Instead, the blocks are restricted to the grid of the world. Learning how to move the blocks allows you to proceed to the next section of the game, where more of the backstory of the game is revealed. You find yourself outside the stronghold of the vampires, the seat of Kain's empire, within which lie the Pillars of Nosgoth, symbols of the world which played a humongous part in the story of the first game. In short, the pillars are linked to the state of the world, and each of them is assigned a guardian, whose mental state defines the state of the pillar, which in turn affects the health of the world itself. In Blood Omen, the guardians were corrupted, and thus the pillars were as well. Your quest as Kain was to kill the corrupted guardians and restore the pillars, allowing new guardians to be selected and the world to be healed. At the end, it was revealed that Kain was the final guardian, and to restore the pillars he had to sacrifice himself, an act which he chose not to do. Now we see the true effects of that choice. Centuries have passed since you were cast into the torment of the abyss, and the world is dying. The formerly lush Nosgoth is devoid of life, and even the ground is shaking and collapsing upon itself. Souls have not returned to the wheel of fate, and all life is disappearing. Perhaps killing Kain is not only good for vengeance, but necessary for the fate of the world itself. Here you can also find your first proper weapon. Sometimes on the walls or on the ground lie sharp objects. These can be used in combat not only as standard weapons, but they can be used as throwing weapons, which, if done properly, can dispatch an enemy in one strike. or during combat, they can be used to impale a stunned enemy. A very useful feature in case there are no environmental hazards around you which you can throw your enemies into. Weapons also demonstrate another interesting feature about the vampires of Nosgoth. If you mortally wound an enemy and for one reason or another are unable to feast on their soul before it dissipates into the spirit realm, the enemy does not actually die. Instead, if you remove the weapon used to impale an enemy, their soul returns to their body and they are resurrected. The game also has a rudimentary stealth system, which the game demonstrates in the only hallway accessible. If you manage to sneak behind an enemy, it is possible to impale them and feed on their soul without having to fight them and subject yourself to danger. A little bit further, you can find a door with a curious glyph on it. This is the marker of the teleport gates and contains your second gate. Unlocking this allows teleportation between the beginning of the game and this room. Unfortunately, the first gate is underwater, so teleporting back to the beginning will instantly destroy your physical form. Still, this gate will be extremely useful. Saving your game can be done via the options menu at any time during the game, and it's very simple. You go to the save menu, choose the save slot, and voila, you're done. This sounds amazing, doesn't it? Saving anywhere, anytime is a great feature. Loading, on the other hand, is done from the main menu. As you have saves available, a new load game section has been added to the start game section of the main menu. From here, you merely choose the appropriate slot and you can return to where you saved. Except, not quite. While saving a game saves things you've done, it does not save where you are. And every time you load a game, you return to the very beginning of the game and have to travel back to where you were from the depths of the abyss. Here is where the teleport gates come in handy, as they act as de facto checkpoints for your progress. If you're unable to find a new gate before having to save and quit, you've basically made no progress. This is kind of understandable, considering the age of the game and the platform it was originally released on. Having a more detailed save game would have likely taken more space on the PlayStation memory card than was reasonable, so the developers chose this option instead. That doesn't make it the most fun feature though, and if you're unaware of this the first time you play, it can be a rather large shock when you first load the game and realize you're nowhere near where you thought you left the game off. Continuing your journey, you find the location of your execution and a route to the home of your clan. Unsurprisingly, after being cast into the abyss, your entire clan was deemed unworthy of serving Kain, and no trace of the bloodline is left within the barren walls of your ancient stronghold. A fact which stokes the hatred within Raziel even more. Passing through the deserted halls, you reach the territory of your first target, Melchiah, the youngest of Kain's lieutenants, and thus also the weakest. Unlike the more beast-like descendants of Duma which you've been fighting thus far, the children of Melchiah seem more like deformed humans. In fact, almost zombie-like in appearance. Not only that, this is the first time you see an actual human being, showing you that despite them being the prey in this desolate world ruled by vampires, some amount of humans still survive and even fight back against the undead menace. Unfortunately, your monstrous visage doesn't really generate trust in a human population that has been hunted for millennia, so they attack you on sight as well. Within Melchiah's domain, you eventually end up in a dead end, and might potentially wonder what you're meant to do here. One way to gain help whenever you're stuck is to return back into the abyss, where standing on a specific highlighted platform has the Elder Guard give you hints on how you should proceed. This time, it reminds you to take advantage of the abilities of your new existence.
Use your newfound talents to gain entry where you have been otherwise impeded.
As demonstrated at the very beginning, shifting between realms can change the geometry of your surroundings, and in this room, that is the only way to proceed forwards. In a way, this area acts as a tutorial to acclimate the player to the ways in which the game expects you to use this realm-shifting ability to solve puzzles. First, you must be in your spectral form to climb the room, but can't proceed unless you move a block in the physical realm, which allows you to open the gate to the next area, which acts as a secondary portion to this tutorial. On both sides of the room there are platforms, but when you jump on one it falls down and the other one rises high into the ceiling. To move forwards, you need to use the platforms to jump across the ceiling, and it can only be done by utilizing the attributes of each realm, by first manipulating the features of the world in the physical realm, and then moving across them in the spirit realm, where you're completely unable to interact with the physical realm. This is a rather brilliant way to familiarize to the player how the realm shifting ability can and will be used, and unlike the basic tutorial at the beginning, is more akin to the organic learning process of Blood Omen's ability dungeons. Melchiah's domain also introduces more block puzzle type variations, such as stacking blocks, how to separate stacked blocks, and also block orientation puzzles where a specific side of the block must be visible and rotated correctly to solve the puzzle. There are also blocks which can change the environment, in this case taking the form of giant braziers that can be used to burn wooden support beams. In this area, you also have your first engagement with a new type of spirit in the spectral realm. Vampire spirits that have been trapped in the spirit form for a long time, unable to return to their bodies. These spirits have learned to harness their vampiric nature in the spectral realm as well, and have the ability to slowly drain your soul during combat if you're not careful. As with many other features of the game, this adds a new danger into the physical realm as well, since if you allow a vampire whose soul has become one of these soul-devouring wraiths to resurrect, they will retain this ability in their physical form. To prevent this from happening, it is possible to defeat and devour the vampire wraith in spirit realm, which in turn causes their incapacitated body to dissolve in the physical realm. A rather ingenious feature that adds complexity to how the player can interact with the world and its denizens. Depending on your actions, you may also encounter one of the more interesting features of the game, despite it in essence being rather minor. In Melchiah's fortress you can meet another human, and their reaction to you depends on whether or not you attacked the first human you met. If you just bypassed them, the humans in the world stop being hostile towards you and instead kneel and raise their arms in reverence. However, if you attack any of the humans, this will stop, and they will be hostile towards you again. This is rather brilliant. Nowhere in the game is this specifically mentioned, since your quest has absolutely nothing to do with humans, but adding a feature such as this beautifully adds more detail to the world, and subtly shows the player how the human population is willing to grasp onto any shred of hope after millennia of persecution. Even if it is a new monstrous creature, but one that only kills vampires. Solving the puzzles in the fortress finally allows you to reach the depths of Melchiah's domain and enter the inner sanctum where he himself waits you, clearly aware of your presence and identity. The introduction of this first boss is very well done, as he shambles from the shadows and his monstrous form is slowly revealed in its grotesque glory. In the centuries since Raziel's judgment, the bodies of Kain's lieutenants have vastly morphed, and these monstrosities are the de facto rulers of the world, especially since Kain has apparently been absent for much of the time you've been gone. How difficult this might make finding your final target is currently irrelevant, since after a short discourse, you end up in the first boss battle. In essence, boss battles are small puzzles instead of straight-up combat. However, Melchiah is so monstrous, your claws do nothing to harm him, so another solution must be found. To make things more interesting, as you run away from your beastly brother, he seems to phase through partially solid objects, like the circular fence in the center of the room. This is because he seems to have evolved to exist simultaneously in both of the realms. Taking advantage of this and the available environmental hazards, you finally defeat Melchiah, who seems content to finally be free of his vile existence. After the battle, the soul of Melchiah is drawn into you, and the Elder God once more talks to you, introducing one of the most important features of the game. As seen during the battle, Melchiah had the ability to phase through certain types of obstacles. Now that you've consumed his soul, this ability has been transferred into you, although in a weakened form. Instead of being able to phase through obstacles in the physical realm, you can only do it in the spectral realm. This is the primary way you receive more abilities, and thus open up more of the world. Each boss you encounter has some kind of an ability, and defeating them unlocks a form of this ability for your use. It's intuitive, gives the player a clear goal with a reward during each portion of the game, and is quite well linked with the lore of the universe in a way more interesting than just finding items from treasure chests. Using your new ability, it is possible to finally breach the walls of the Vampire Sanctuary, where the Elder God teaches you about yet another feature of the game: health power-ups. These pie-shaped artifacts are reminiscent of pieces of heart in the Legend of Zelda series. To increase your maximum health, you must find 5 of these slices, after which the health spiral automatically grows larger. In many ways, the way this feature is introduced has been done well. It comes just after finishing your first dungeon, and is in a position where it's impossible to miss, as you have to pass by it. And finding out what it is immediately gives the player more motivation to keep a lookout for these objects. In fact, it's already possible you may have seen these before, but in places where you've been unable to reach them. This adds a tangible reason to do more exploring whenever you gain a new ability, since now there's obviously something to gain from treading outside the rather linear main story path. It is also possible that this is not the first shard you've encountered, if you're one of those people who don't need an incentive to begin exploring, as immediately after leaving Melchiah's domain, you can jump into the water and find a cage with one of these shards that you can now obtain with the new phasing ability. Regardless of which piece you find first, that is where the function of these objects is explained to you by the Elder God. In the same lake is another caged-off area, where you can find a hidden shrine which unlocks the first of many completely optional abilities. Solving the rather simple puzzle activates the shrine, causing a mysterious item to appear. This item unlocks your first glyph magic spell. Spells are completely optional rewards for exploring more, and can be very useful in different situations, such as using the shockwave of a spell to push an enemy into an environmental hazard. Spells, however, require charges to use them. To use the spells and see your charges, you need to enter the spell menu, which also contains the realm shifting ability. In the top corner, you can see how much power the selected spell requires and your total amount of magical energy. To recharge your spell energy, the game has several locations of power that you can step on and immediately gain more charges to use the spells with, or by finding energy recharge pickups from either the environment or as random drops when defeating foes. Increasing your magical energy can be done in 2 ways. First, by finding more spells, each of which also increases the maximum pool of energy you can store, or by finding collectible glyphs hidden across the world. Deeper within the sanctuary, you reach the Pillars of Nosgoth. In the millennia since Blood Omen, they have clearly decayed. No more do they reach to the skies, but lie crumbled as a testament to Kain's choice and the decay of the world. Here the Vampire Lord himself is waiting for you, and has not changed at all since the introduction video. Unlike Melchiah, whose slow evolution had turned him humongous and monstrous, Kain's change seems to have stagnated. After a short dialogue where Raziel's rather naive and idealistic nature is made obvious, and where Kain declares you would never be able to understand the gravity of his decisions, you fight each other rather early in the game. Kain draws his legendary sword, the Soul Reaver, he found from the Avernus Cathedral during the events of Blood Omen, and used to slay William the Just in the past, altering the timeline as per Mobius's plans, dooming the vampire population of the time to a certain death in the hands of vampire hunters. According to Raziel, whenever Kain draws the Soul Reaver, it means certain death to whomever is the target of his ire. Fortunately, you're already dead, so your physical body can be destroyed multiple times during this battle, as you try to fight against the camera and the rather short time limit between Kain's attacks, and finally, you lose. This is one of my pet peeves in video games, and thankfully it's not that badly done here, especially since it's more than likely you'll take damage during the fight and have to regain your physical form until you get used to what the boss battle expects you to do, and are able to do it quickly enough. But whenever a game has you take control for a battle, forces you to win the battle, but then has you lose, I've never liked it. At least have the same outcome happen if you actually lose, or just don't have that fight as a boss battle in the first place, but just as a cutscene. It just feels wrong whenever one thing happens within the gameplay, but then the cutscene afterwards completely undermines what you've just done. Kain immobilizes you with his magical powers and raises the Soul Reaver for a finishing blow. Then he strikes, and the blade shatters in a flash of light into hundreds of small pieces. For some reason, this does not faze Kain at all. Instead, he proclaims that you two are now one step closer to your destinies, before teleporting away. From this point onwards, there will be many more spoilers, which is a good thing to know just in case you wish to play the game for yourself, and don't want the twists and turns of the game to be ruined for you. Just a little warning though, I was unable to get the PC version of this game to work on my desktop PC, which was quite unfortunate. Thankfully, Soul Reaver is also available on the PlayStation 3 as one of the PlayStation Classics titles, so there are options to get the game to work in one way or another. Even though the blow from the Soul Reaver was unable to completely destroy your soul, as it is said to do, it did inflict enough physical damage to cause you to return to the Spirit Realm, fatigued from the fight. In the Spirit Realm, something curious manifests before you. The spirit that gave the Soul Reaver its magical powers now resides in the Spirit Realm. Unable to act on its own, this spirit craves for a host and quickly attaches itself onto you, wrapping itself around your arm, embedding its own existence onto yours. Now you are forever linked with this entity, two beings that feed on souls, now connected by a twist of fate. In gameplay terms, the spirit form the Soul Reaver acts as a new weapon. In the Spirit Realm, the Soul Reaver is always on your arm and changes the animations of your basic attack moves, adding more damage and range to your battle abilities. In the Physical Realm, however, the Reaver is only able to manifest while your health is full, making it very easy to lose access to this weapon. So, while the blade itself is extremely powerful, due to this limitation it's not an easy win game feature, as whether you like it or not, eventually your health will go down in the Physical Realm, either by taking damage from the enemies or the environment. Once the blade has been introduced to you, the moment is disturbed by a familiar spirit. Even after all the millennia since the events of Blood Omen, the spirit of Ariel is still bound to the pillars. This time, clearly more cynical, which is understandable. She has had the front row seat on Kain's empire, not only having to exist through Kain's refusal to sacrifice himself to restore the pillars, but seeing him build the seat of his empire on top of her prison. After making it clear that you're no friend of Kain either, Ariel seems to have a glimmer of hope again. The only way for her to be released from her eternal torment is for Kain to be killed and the Pillar of Balance restored, allowing the pillars and as a result the world to begin healing. So she offers her assistance in your quest to kill Kain. After all, she has many millennia of knowledge that could perhaps be of use to you. From this point onwards, the game follows a familiar pattern. You receive a target which leads to a dungeon with puzzles and enemies, at the end of which you battle a boss and receive their signature ability for your own. After which you can explore new areas for secrets and also reach the lair of your new target. As you defeat your vampire brothers, eventually your path leads you to the Tomb of the Sarafan. These warriors were mentioned in Blood Omen, and Malek, the Condemned Knight, was the last of this order. The Sarafan were, in essence, zealous warriors whose exploits could be seen in the introduction of Blood Omen, as they waged a holy war against the vampire population of Nosgoth, claiming entire bloodlines to their swords. This fact was not unknown to Kain, and in an act of ultimate irony, it is revealed that you and your brothers once were these Sarafan knights, now turned into the very beings you once hunted. Fueled by the ever-growing hatred for Kain, Raziel's path is now even clearer than before, and you cut through your transformed vampire brothers, who are unable to supply you with much information about Kain, but with their souls, imbue you with even more abilities. Eventually, either the Elder God or Ariel guide you towards your final destination and the hiding place of Kain, deep within the caverns of Mobius the Time Streamer. from the chamber where Mobius once performed his role as the Oracle of Nosgoth opens a path deep into the bowels of the mountain where the final puzzles of the game reside. Solving those puzzles, the story begins to pick up and change, in a similar way as in Blood Omen, where a vast majority of the game was rather simple, and you learn more about the world you were exploring while hunting down your targets, before the final twist of Mobius' time-streaming device sending Kain into the past. This time you're not sent into the past, but instead as you walk through the corridors of Mobius' hidden laboratory, you encounter strange walls which give you a glimpse through time. At first, you see things that have already happened. Your rebirth into the Soul Reaver in the Elder God's lair, your first encounter with Kain, and so on. This causes Raziel to begin questioning the entire experience. Did Kain foresee all that was to happen, or is this merely one of his tricks meant to confuse you? Further down the corridor, you see events which have yet to happen. Encountering Kain, striking down Ariel with the spectral Soul Reaver, and a cryptic scene of Raziel overlooking something while the Soul Reaver blade is glowing black and red. Are these visions of what is to happen, or what can happen, or neither? Finally, you reach the bottom of the caverns and find Kain in a chamber full of strange machinery. He taunts you for being slow, and the two vampires engage in a sort of philosophical debate. Kain clearly has a plan, and believes it all has been foretold, and the two of you are merely acting out your roles in the ultimate plan of the universe where your fates are preordained. Whereas Raziel refuses to accept this, seeing it as an excuse for all of Kain's atrocities. Then you engage in one of the most annoying boss battles of the game, which is made difficult mostly because of the difficult camera controls of the game. In practice, the battle is the same as the first encounter with Kain. He teleports around the room and you must quickly find him, get to him, and strike him. Why it's more difficult this time is because there are 3 levels to the chamber. And when he jumps to the final level, it's extremely difficult to see where he actually is. And if you go into the free look mode to locate him, it's more than likely you will not have enough time to jump to the top level to strike him afterwards before he teleports away. Eventually, as you manage to land the final blow, Kain explains that this is not where your story will end, and runs through the portal he's opened by operating the machinery as you've fought. The Elder God warns Raziel, implying it's not safe for him to pass through the portal. But he does not listen. You end up somewhere dark, where only a portion of the floor is lit up. This floor has the symbol of the time streamer on it, and suddenly, Mobius himself walks out from the shadows, greeting Raziel and welcoming him to his destiny. Soul Reaver is, without a doubt, one of my favorite games of all time, but it still has many things it can be criticized for. The controls for the time are relatively good, but there are several moments where the lack of free camera controls becomes a massive hindrance. As an example, the final battle with Kain is made more difficult than it could be, specifically because the camera controls are not terribly good. Obviously, I'm not a professional game developer, so I don't know how difficult it would have been to do this, but considering the PlayStation already had controllers that would have allowed for a more free camera control, it is a shame they didn't add that as an option, even if the primary means of camera control were still made for the controllers that didn't have analog sticks. This alone would have made several aspects of the game much better. Because of the camera controls, it's quite common to have enemies attack you from outside your view, and have it take a while to adjust the camera and actually be able to fight the enemy effectively. Thankfully, as in Blood Omen, fighting is far from being the primary focus of the game, and more often than not, battles can be completely avoided, as the focus of the game is in platforming and puzzle solving. Platforming as well is only made worse than it could be by the lack of good camera controls, as it can be difficult to accurately gauge the distance between where you are and where you're trying to jump to, as even the height of the camera is not constant and can vary between rooms. The spectral shifting ability of the game, on the other hand, is absolutely fantastic, and adds a very interesting layer on top of the standard exploration. Having two versions of the map with slight differences that block progress in one realm and allow it in another is to me one of the most interesting features added into a game of this type. Even the way how the different realms affect each other is quite amazing, and how this feature not only links with the puzzle solving and exploration of the game, but the lore of the game as well, as is the case with Belkaya or the Vampire Spectres, just shows how much thought was put into the feature, as instead of having it just as a half-baked gimmick, the existence of it actually matters for the overall plot of the game. The realm shifting also acts as a great demonstration of the audio-visual aspects of the game. In my opinion, for the time, the game looks really good, and how the geometry of the world dynamically changes as you shift between the realms is very smooth and impressive. This also changes the dynamic lighting of the scene, changing the natural-looking lighting of the physical realm into the more surreal color scheme of the spectral realm. The visual aspect is not the only thing that changes, but so does the soundscape and the music, with the sounds becoming more distant and distorted. Each area also has different versions of the zone music for the physical realm and the spectral realm, with a similar difference in the soundscape being present in the music as well. Most of the music in the game isn't exactly melodic, but is more atmospheric, with a heavy emphasis on percussion and bass. This creates a somewhat unreal and apocalyptic feeling with the music alone, and the composition of these pieces, while not something I'd be likely to listen to on my free time, works absolutely brilliantly to create the atmosphere of the game. Puzzles, on the other hand, are one of the best and worst parts of the game. While there's some variety to the block puzzles, and solving those sometimes takes a reasonable amount of thinking, which I very much appreciate, there's no getting around the fact that in the larger scale of things, the puzzles end up becoming somewhat repetitive the longer you play. Even the final block puzzles aren't actually that difficult, and figuring out what to do, which to me is the best part of these puzzles, doesn't take that long. Instead, the time-consuming part of the puzzles is the moving and turning of the blocks, and how sometimes to solve the puzzle you have to run between two areas after each move, which does end up feeling like unnecessary padding. After all, when you know exactly what you want to do and how to do it, when it still takes several minutes to go through the motions to reach the solutions, it's not exactly the most engaging gameplay. Still, despite this, for the most part, solving the puzzles is actually quite fun, even if there comes a point in the game where the block puzzles wear out their welcome. It is a shame this is the primary form of puzzles, as the game does have other types of puzzles, some of which are criminally underutilized. For example, at a late stage of the game, you gain the ability to rotate large objects by running around them, a feature which ends up being barely used, and in only a few smaller puzzles in the final dungeon of the game. This to me is a massive shame, since we have one puzzle that deals with reflecting light and changing the color of the light by channeling it through certain colored prisms, showing that there could have been other types of puzzles, and that in fact, the coding for these puzzles actually exist. This just makes me question, why did they opt for the block puzzles as the primary means to challenge the players, when they clearly had other options in their repertoire? That is in fact the case with many of the abilities you unlock, that they are not utilized that much during the main quest of the game. For example, while the ability to swim finally turns the previously deadly pools of water into new pathways you couldn't previously traverse, this is really only used to reach a couple optional secrets, and areas you have to go into to finish the game don't take advantage of your new immunity to water. From what I gather, this is partially because a bunch of content ended up being cut from the game, and one area where you never have to go, that does in fact take advantage of the swimming system, has been relegated to a completely optional area. Another aspect, which may or may not be due to cut content, kinda works as a sort of cliffhanger for those who paid enough attention, as it's not directly mentioned in the game. But for all the fratricide you commit, one of the vampire lieutenants, Turel, is never seen in the game, and you merely fight some of his kin. This leaves the opportunity open for him to make an appearance in a later game. One problem with the exploration aspect of the game is the lack of a world map within the game. This is obviously not a deal breaker, and most of the world is rather linear, making the world map not be a necessity for exploration. The story is where the game really shines for me. Not only is the writing absolutely fantastic, it also speaks to the edgy emo in me that never seems to properly grow up. While the story works quite well without ever having played the first game, as Soul Reaver explains to you enough about the previous game to have the current plot make enough sense, it still has plenty of references to Blood Omen that add another layer of subtext for those who've played the first game as well. Even when it comes to optional areas, this is the case, as if you explore the apocalyptic Nosgoth properly, you can find the lair of Nupraptor. When I first found this location, it was amazing. Does it have any meaning for the plot of Soul Reaver? Nope. Absolutely none. But it is a nice little reminder that this still takes place in the same world, and having the place of the person who was the catalyst of all of these events be that reminder, I love it. Other optional areas add to the lore of the current game, such as the human citadel you can visit. Currently in the game there is absolutely no need to visit the place, but you can find some extra collectibles in the area. Other than that, it acts as a place for environmental storytelling. Not only does the existence of a human citadel show you that while humans are no longer the apex predators of the planet, they are still surviving, and have come up with defenses to keep the vampires at bay, at least to an extent. Also, as mentioned before, if you've stayed your hand and not attacked humans, the denizens of the human citadel either ignore you, or some even revere you as a kind of savior. After all, you're going through the world destroying the worst enemies of the humans while leaving them alone. While if you have attacked humans, these ones consider you a threat as well, and demonstrate in practice how dangerous their new weaponry can be. The environmental storytelling of the world is rather fantastic and tells you a short story of the nature of the vampires you're hunting, as almost every single one of these creatures has made its lair in a location that was once somehow meaningful to the humans. These act as a clear demonstration of force to any of the remaining humans, as the mere existence of vampires in these former human strongholds is a constant reminder to who is the stronger faction in Nosgoth. For example, Zephon's lair is in a stronghold that once was a massive weapon intended to destroy the vampires using sound waves. The lair of Rahab is in an ancient cathedral, now sunken beneath the ocean, and so on. The story also delves into some more philosophical topics, albeit briefly. The Elder God is in a sense a depiction of the status quo, the wheel of fate, a circle, churning forwards, never changing, keeping the souls of the world in a cycle of death and rebirth for all time. This has been disrupted by Kain's refusal to sacrifice himself and the creation of his immortal vampire empire. Instead, now the souls are trapped by an act of defiance, never to be reborn. Raziel, on the other hand, is brought into this world, unwilling, but reborn as one who is meant to restore the souls of the dead to the wheel of fate by eradicating the vampires. A newborn creature, still trying to find his place in this world. Kain seems to believe in the concept of fate, and after centuries of examining and studying the machines of Mobius, seems dedicated to seeing whatever destiny he's foreseen through to the end. What he seems to think as well is that it's not only his fate, but his right to do so. What this plan is? We do not know. Raziel, for the most part, doesn't seem to care as much about the grander scale of things, but is more focused on vengeance as the first goal. Whatever else there is comes secondary, if at all. The discussions between the characters are written well, and all of the voice actors do a phenomenal job portraying these people.
As long as a single one of us stands, we are Legion. And that is why, when I must sacrifice my children to the void, I can do so with a clear heart.
Very poetic, Kain. But in the end, you offer no more than a convenient rationalization for your crimes.
The one negative aspect about this is how some of the effects added onto the voice lines of the vampires can make understanding them a little bit difficult. This could have been remedied by having subtitles in the game, but unfortunately, at the time Soul Reaver was developed, it was rather common that games did not give you the option to have them. For now, these topics are explored only on a surface level, but since the game leaves on a cliffhanger and a large "to be continued" text, it's not an unreasonable expectation that they will be explored in more depth in a sequel. In conclusion, Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver is a fantastic game, but with some flaws that are a result of the time the game was developed in. The graphics are great for the time, and the soundscape amplifies the atmosphere of the world fantastically. The story and the characters are memorable and really got me to crave more of their story, which was quite nicely teased at the end of the game. Gameplay itself is decent, and the largest negative in it is the way the camera controls, and how some of the puzzles become a little bit tedious towards the end of the game. The world of Soul Reaver is well built and fascinatingly conveys an apocalyptic future of which we saw merely a glimpse in the canon ending of Blood Omen. Would I recommend people play this? Absolutely. If you can imagine enjoying a game about vampires which plays out somewhat similarly to games like Ocarina of Time, go for it. But that is it for this time, and I would like to thank all of the Ko-fi and Patreon supporters: High Food Court, Iliad Drone, Paul Leone, The Bloke, Zai, and Daniel Zupke. Thank you, everyone, for supporting this project. For next time, we shall continue further down the story of Raziel with Soul Reaver 2, where perhaps the twists of fate become a little bit more clear. Or just more confusing. We'll see. But until then, Fintrovert, signing out.